Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the third segment of the Indian Arts Research Center Speaker Series. The IARC initiative that is the focus of this evening's discussion is a result of over 3 years of critical discourse among museum professionals, cultural leaders, artists, and scholars that has resulted in the creation of an online resource for communities and museums, forging collaboration and a new movement in the field of museology. It is my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Mr. Jim Enote, from the Pueblo Zuni, who is moderating this evening's panel discussion. Jim will always identify himself first and foremost as a farmer and artist, before listing his professional titles and credentials. Currently, Jim serves as director of the Shiwi Awan Museum and Heritage Center in Zuni, as well as director of the Colorado Plateau Foundation. Jim also serves on numerous boards, including the Board of Trustees for the Grand Canyon Trust and the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation. Most recently, Jim served as senior advisor to the Tribal Coalition and Law Unit, who developed the Bears Ears Monument proclamation signed last year by President Obama. Jim has also served as a senior advisor for mountain cultures at the Mountain Institute. He is a New Mexico Community Luminaria recipient, an E.F. Schumacher Society Fellow, and in 2010 was awarded the Michael M. Haynes Prize for Innovative Museum Anthropology. All this said, Jim still finds contentment in his garden, in his cornfields, and the mountains of his homeland in Zuni Pueblo. I will add that Jim was recently appointed as the chair for this year's national meeting of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. And this year's conference is taking place in Tamaya on the Santa Ana Pueblo Reservation. Jim is joined this evening by representatives of the core working group of this initiative, and I must express my deepest gratitude on behalf of SAR for their leadership and commitment towards this new movement. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you, Brian. Is the mic on? Yeah, sounds like it. The idea of collecting objects representing cultures of the world is not a new one. In Europe, people with the means to do so traveled around the world and collected things and kept them at home and kind of showed them off at their fancy parties, and they essentially were kind of cabinets of curiosity. Later, that idea became institutionalized as colleges also began to develop collections and acquire things from around the world as part of their teaching work and their mission to use objects to explain and try to understand cultures around the world. And then sometimes exhibiting. And then later museums took on this role in a much more deliberate and larger way. And it was only a matter of time then that collections then started to have a special kind of value. They were sometimes very rare items. Maybe they were the last things that were made by some people. They were even things that have gone extinct. And they were important pieces of cultures that we began to see needed special care. And so over time then, the idea of conserving those objects became a major task of museums and their staffs. And so evolved the role of conservators to assure that they are stable, that they will be around for a long time for people to enjoy and study. And this work required both science and some art. And the people that we have here with us are definitely representative of those disciplines. So this is still, it's contentious because, as I say, these things have been collected from cultures around the world, ended up in museums, and they are some rare items, some of the last things. And museums have taken upon themselves to be somewhat like the stewards of the human experience. But we've seen some changes, haven't we? And so in 1990, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act enabled Native communities to assume a new role in this kind of museum work, and the sales have been shifting ever since. Native communities began to see their works in museums and noticed that things were misidentified, inadequately identified, mistreated, sometimes inappropriately treated, definitely, and sometimes inefficiently treated or taken care of. And so NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, opened this door a little bit more, and today we're seeing a movement by communities that are seeking to interact with museums and the staff working in these museums that are taking care of these things. So now we're beginning to see a new kind of movement that is around developing relationships with the collections and the people that are taking care of those collections. And so this is what brought about this idea to create community and museum guidelines for collaboration. So these guidelines were developed over several years with input from dozens of experts from communities and institutions. So it wasn't only just people working in museums that developed these guidelines, it was actually people from communities and people working in tribal museums and elsewhere that came together over a few years. So I should say also that these guidelines are not a replacement for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act process. That's a different process altogether. So we're talking about here is communities saying, you know what, we've seen things in museums, we want to engage with them more, we want to develop relationships with them. How do we go about doing that? We've made a visit, but how do we take it to the next level? And so we've talked about this for quite some time and said, well, we need to create some guidelines. But even the idea of calling it guidelines was a matter we spent a lot of time talking about, right? It's, should be called guidelines? Should they be recommendations? Should they be called protocols? In the end, many people just felt that, I guess in terms of vernacular, people generally felt that the idea of guidelines was an accessible idea. We didn't want to get too deep into calling something protocols or recommendations that would require some kind of oversight. So let me get started then. So that tonight then, we have a few members of the core team that put together the guidelines and I think assembled all together have over 70 years professional working experience with collections. Yeah, I think it's over 70 years. Maybe I should say 200 years.
Okay, all right.
Could be
Why
more.
would you start with that?
And I'm cutting it low right there. No. So on my immediate left is Landis Smith, and Landis is a projects conservator at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture here in Santa Fe. She is also a collaborative conservation programs consultant at the Indian Arts Research Center here at the School for Advanced Research. She's also a research associate at the National Museum of the American Indian. Landis was previously the Anchorage project conservator at the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, National Museum of Natural History, and conservator in the Department of Anthropology, American Museum of Natural History in New York. And much of Landis's career has been focused on developing conservation and documentation methodologies that are collaborative with Native artists, elders, and cultural leaders. And in the middle here is Kelly McHugh. Kelly is an objects conservator at the National Museum of the American Indian, where she has worked since 1996. And I was reading through some of her works, and at one time she was involved with working and moving over 800,000 items from the New York Center to the center in Suitland, Maryland, right? So she knows a lot about the collections at NMAI. She has played a major role in NMAI's collaborative conservation methodology, and we'll ask her about that. She is deeply involved in the Andrew Mellon Fellowship Program at NMAI, which gives her the opportunity to work closely with many fellows and interns as they form their conservation professional skills and practice. And then finally, Ellen Pearlstein. From 1983 to 2005, Ellen was an objects conservator at the Brooklyn Museum. And in 2005, she moved to Los Angeles to assume a faculty position in the UCLA Getty program in the conservation of archaeological and ethnographic material. Ellen is a fellow in the American Institute for Conservation. She is a winner of the Keck Award and is vice president of the Association of North American Graduate Programs in Conservation. I'm going to jump right into things. We're going to have an interesting format where it's going to be mainly discussion and debate maybe, and we'll have a few jump balls in there too. So I think that as with any profession, we're striving to work smarter, and it's museum work is no different. So in museum work, and our idea for building museum guidelines for communities, or how communities can work with museums, it's really about reuniting the collections with communities. I like to call it socializing the collections. Establishing relationships based on mutual respect with workers in museums and effecting change in museums. Adding to and correcting museum collection records as well. I mean, I can remember in the mid-'80s writing letters to museums and asking if there were some Zuni things in their collections, and we would get a letter back and asking what our credentials were, what our research proposal was, and I was just asking, I just want to know if there are any things of ours in their collections and what condition they're in. It was very hard to get a foot in the door, and well, NAGPRA changed a lot of that. So as we began to have visits and meetings and interactions and actually see some of the collections, I remember seeing some things that were so terribly misidentified. In fact, there were some things that we'd seen in a museum where we looked at, and these were Zuni experts from the museum that I represent. We looked at some objects in a collection, there was a box of them, and we said, okay, we know what these are. And then we looked at the catalog, and the catalog said something different, and we said, no, that's not what these are. And the staff there said, are you sure? And we said, of course we're sure. You know, we make them, we still make them. And the staff said, oh my goodness, you know, that a student just finished her dissertation based on this set of stuff. And so I asked then that, well, how many degrees do you think you've bestowed on your students based on these collections that definitely have some misidentification and false mislabeling and so on? And they said probably quite a few. So it's in their interest then to work with the communities, right, to set the record straight. But it's also in the community's interest to work to set the record straight, because these days many things in museums are digitized and information is traveling around. People can learn about themselves, their own identity, their own heritage online, but if the museums are keeping the wrong information, that's not good for anybody. There's that old song by Buffalo Springfield, what is it? There's something happening here, right? And there's a line in there that says, nobody is right if everybody's wrong. So it kind of reminded me of that. And that the same thing kind of happens in museums. So the idea of creating enabling environments for communities to work with museums, I think, well, it all sounds very fitting, but I think there's going to be some cultural bias still. I mean, there's surely something that must be dealt with, and so this work will require a new level of collaboration. And I asked the panelists here to send me some of their things that they've written, and so I've been doing a lot of reading about their background and their works. And Landis, I'm going to ask you first, that in an article about collaborative decisions, because collaboration is going to be a big part of this work if it's going to happen, if it's going to really succeed. You wrote that cultural biases cannot be completely avoided, but they can be minimized through the collaborative use of multiple perspectives and an investigation of the contextual history of the object. So how does that play into the guidelines work? What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that, well, to fully contextualize collections, we usually start with museum records, the literature, getting perspectives from various experts. But most important is getting, having a discussion, a conversation with community members about what we're looking at. And, you know, thinking about it, let's say, the aesthetics of silver or, you know, silver jewelry, for example. You know, who's to say how it should look? I mean, it's an aesthetic question. Our cultural bias would be often to keep a patina on it, to not to over clean, for example, but you know, talking with elders, sometimes they actually want to see things at a higher polish. So who gets to say how these things look? There was an exhibit here I haven't talked about this in like 2 decades, but there was an exhibit here, actually Bettina Raphael worked on it, of silver, and things were cleaned to a fairly high polish because that's the way community members wanted it to be seen. But actually dealers in town were very upset. They thought the museum had ruined its collection and that it's not the way those things should look. So in that way, that sort of perspective helps you to not impose your own personal aesthetic or cultural bias on the things that you're working with.
So you have different perspectives, even within a community, that maybe an artist may say, please treat it this way or not. And then another part of the community may say, well, this represents all of us, and we'd like to see it handled or treated this way. Have any of you ever experienced something like that?
Yes, which, you know, makes sense because groups of people all don't think the same thing. But that is, I would say, a challenge for those of us working in the museum, and often one that I hear my museum professionals say, well, we don't really know who to talk to, or I've heard 2 different, you know, opinions, and who should we listen to, what direction should we follow? And I think in thinking about the guidelines, this was a huge impetus for this because, you know, I think within communities, there is a level of discussion that has to happen, a level of organization, perhaps, that has to happen in order to kind of come to, we all have to come to the table, right, with kind of equity and informed positions. And so I think the museum has on its shoulders the responsibility of doing its research, you know, kind of going through, understanding the tribal structure, understanding, you know, who the different people are in the tribe. And I will say, as a result of NAGPRA, those infrastructures exist more than they ever have. And so there are places for people to start in terms of working with communities. But the idea to do 2 sets of guidelines, I think kind of some of that was inspired by this very notion that, you know, there has to be some kind of mobilization within communities themselves in terms of dealing with museums.
Right, and by 2 sets of guidelines, you're referring to the next set of guidelines, which is for how museums can work with communities. So this is specifically right now is how communities can work with museums. The next set of guidelines is museums working with communities, and you would think that people would get it now. You know, even I know that back in the the 80s was very difficult. 90s was, things were starting to change. I know that there was a very staid kind of just oppressive almost. It was very difficult to work with museums, and there were some junior staff that were saying, she's not about to retire anytime soon. Yes, referring to supervisors. But that was in the mid 80s, and now those people have retired. And there's definitely a fresh group of workers that have come into the field, absolutely. And Ellen, you've in 2016 in an article you wrote, you were talking about embedding significance into conservation decision-making in graduate education. So you've started to bring this in, literally embed it into the kind of education.
Yeah.
Say something about that, please.
So in a variety of different ways, initially, actually, as Jim mentioned, I've started teaching at UCLA, at the UCLA Getty program in 2005, and immediately sought out tribal museums in the area that had cultural collections and also had sort of local, people with holding great knowledge about these collections, and decided that the only way in which I could effectively teach is by sharing the teaching platform with community members, that we would invite in collections from area museums and invite in weavers, invite in ethnobotanists, invite in curators, and have them participate, and also have the students suddenly have this light bulb go off that says that there is an entire this basket you're working on has relatives, it has family, it has it's part of a community, it's playing a role in a community, and if you try to make your own, if you don't understand that in conservation decision making, you're leaving out a huge component. And so I keep feeling like, okay, if we've got to start with the youngins, we've got to get them when they're young. When young people who've decided to go to conservation school, they are approaching the world that Jim is referring to. It's a changing world in conservation that we're all kind of working toward, and these are students that are going to step up into that world. And in that particular article, actually, I actually asked students to bring in family heirlooms from their own families, and I asked them well in advance, so they had plenty of time to really talk to their relatives and talk about what was really important to their grandmother, their grandfather, their uncle, their aunt, and they brought those items in. I'm pretty sure all the students thought they'd be conserving their own family heirloom. But what I did was I said, no, actually, one of your classmates is going to conserve your family's heirloom, because when you work in museums, you are frequently conserving somebody else's heirloom, somebody else's item of importance. And I wanted them to sort of suddenly recognize that everything that they had brought in that was so full of meaning, suddenly it looked like they didn't know how to deal with it. They wouldn't touch each other's items because they thought that would be disrespectful, even though we all touch things in museums. We frequently just generalize touching in a museum. So they all were struck by the fact that they needed to defer to somebody else who had a stronger connection to this cultural material. And then they also had to use the student who was the heir to be they had to learn how to find out about significance respectfully and in exchange. And so that class and the earlier class working with local tribes are two things that I continued with.
So this really sounds wonderful. Why do you think this hasn't happened before?
Yeah. I have a lot of opinions about this. Well, I mean, I think that, programs like UCLA, it's amazing what Ellen is doing, and it's really important, I think, because she sees the importance and the critical nature of incorporating Native knowledge systems into the care of Native collections. I do think, though, that we are still dealing with, a system that is not equal. It's still the conservator. We can invite people in. It's still on our terms. And so, we're moving in that direction. But I think that it's also, the tribes kind of really requiring or demanding that collaboration or that connection, that will probably drive this forward in the future.
So this, this brings up a question then of, I've seen that sometimes things don't often work for us. I'm speaking about Native communities, just like our MO is constantly pushing back, fighting something, trying to raise our hand all the time. And if we talk about ethics, is that really successful? Is that a successful approach to creating change in museums? To say that it's an ethical thing to do, what do you think of that?
Yeah, that argument doesn't always work with people who don't care. But what does work is doing better work. So if you engage with communities, your work is upgraded, just in terms of accuracy and a perspective that makes sense.
So you could say that, I've seen this myself also, but you could say that sentiments and ethics don't really, they aren't what really motivates change. Right?
I would definitely say sentiment doesn't motivate change. Ethics might to a certain degree. I think if conservators can fundamentally believe, just as they believe that scientific analysis contributes to their treatment decisions, that, collaborating with someone who possesses more knowledge than themselves regarding the cultural aspects or the material aspects or the technology aspects of a certain item is just as important or critical as your scientific analysis. I think until conservators can kind of embrace that as critical in terms of their ethical and responsible work,
And seeing that sort of expertise in communities as being something that's on par with scholarship. Yeah.
So how does your field then respond to this? Are there standards? I mean, I think standards are okay for airplanes and electricity, but standards for museum and conservation work, how do your colleagues respond to you working with communities to treat something in a very unconventional way?
Yeah.
I mean, are you guys the black sheep? Are you guys the renegades? Where do you guys sit?
I think one of the things that probably we encountered when, as Jim, you were talking about like the 1980s in museums, and, we encountered, as we all know, curators feeling challenged that somebody, because their card was, I'm an expert, I know about this, I know all about this. And we, in conservation, we also, it's like, wait a minute, I know how to do this, this is this kind of item. My calling card is that I know how to do this. And I think a lot of people do feel challenged if they, I'm curious what you all think, but I think a lot of people do feel challenged if they have to kind of take a step back and recognize that there are other equally important kinds of knowledge about this, this item, this particular item, that should be considered in its conservation.
And I still find that sometimes that Native perspective or the community knowledge is dismissed. It can be dismissed. It's listened to and then dismissed.
And people have also told me that that's great, but we're looking for practical information. So, I think, again,
that's great, but how do we treat this thing,
And to say that it's, I think that fundamentally, again, it's kind of where the constructs of the profession started, we really, I think until we really start examining that, there can be some change. But the change has been very, very slow. I'm the youngest one up here, and I think that
back in 1980.
But I think that there is progress, and that's excellent.
Yeah.
But I think until we start really taking a hard look at the constructs of our profession, we're limiting ourselves in some way.
And I have to say, Ellen Pearlstein here is one of the people who it really is changing the face of the profession, I think.
Well,
I mean,
thank
there
you
are
for that.
four graduate programs in the US,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And UCLA is the only one that I know of that is really, really addressing these things.
Thank you.
So let's circle around back to the communities. So you've worked with many communities over the years. And initially, I guess around NAGPRO, even before that, but you've worked with communities before, and when they've been introduced to some of the objects from their communities, and you expose them to the kind of treatments or stabilizing or reconstruction or fixing that you do, how do they respond to that? Do they, because I think, quite frankly, in those situations, they are in your space, they're in your house. There's this asymmetry of powers going on, right?
Yeah.
So how do they respond when they finally have an opportunity, when you say, what do you think?
I mean,
We all have, go ahead.
yeah. You know, it depends on where your relationship is at that point. You know, what do you think about something? You know, if you have a long-standing, long-term relationship with people, it's a different thing, and there's a shift in power and authority that happens in a successful collaboration. Without that happening, you're still in that sort of, that unequal power thing. Yeah.
Now, what does that shift look like? Is it something that happens over 5 years or 2 years, or is it something like an epiphany that happens to you?
Right. It can happen right away.
Yeah, well, I can give an example. Just we've been working on some eagle feather headdresses from the plains for an upcoming exhibition that's going to open in October. And there are Cheyenne and Lakota headdresses selected for this exhibition. And so I've had the occasion to work on these headdresses in the past, and each time I'm kind of like, oh gosh, no, I don't know what the appropriate thing to do is with these. I don't know, how to handle them. We know that these are important items culturally. So this time I was like, let's bring some people in and let's start having some of these conversations. And so we asked Dwayne Hollow-Hornbear, who we had an established relationship with. We had gone out to South Dakota, to Rosebud, and worked with him out there. So we had built somewhat of a relationship. When he came, I still think walking into the conservation lab, seeing the headdress laid out on a table, it's very clinical looking. I mean, we try to make it look good with some posters and some, but it's very clinical looking in there. So, I think it was it's kind of, his initial reaction was to be a little bit taken aback. And then as we started talking about the headdresses, he was sharing, information, but more talking about the connectedness to Lakota cosmology, to the eagle, and kind of adjusting the way we approach looking at it. Instead of looking at something and dissecting it as an object, looking at it in context, just as a Lakota person would approach an item like this. And so the results of that encounter and engagement, the power shifted instantly, but because of our established relationship, that wasn't so much of an issue. But I think what most of us were left with at the end of that was, I always looked at these as one item, a headdress. But I think after talking with Dwayne and understanding the importance of each eagle feather to an individual and how hard it is to earn one of those, the piece took on a whole other level of importance. And I think the challenging thing for conservators is that we love to quantify. I mean, we like science. I like science. And we like to quantify and we like to look at our graphs. The hard thing about this information is that you can't quantify it. I can't put what Dwayne told me into a graph. And so that's why it's not going to be easily maybe communicated or valued, perhaps, in the same way that something scientific is valued. So just recently, just last week, we had Conrad Fisher from Northern Cheyenne come, and Conrad is the vice president for the Northern Cheyenne. And when Conrad came, I did not know him before. We had had some really good conversations on the phone. But when he came, despite all of the information I had given him, and I literally was like, page 4, did I do everything in the guidelines? Did I make sure I did this? he came with a certain, again, kind of struck by the environment where the headdresses were, but he came with a mission or an agenda from the tribe itself. And so the first day of that was really challenging because he was talking about sending those headdresses home. He wasn't interested in talking about the care of them or the preparation of them for the exhibition. So we had to go through a day of really hard discussion and difficult conversation. And, I did my best to convey to him, like, in some ways we're artifacts of history too. Like, we're here right now. And so I invited you because I really want to know what can we do given the circumstance we're in right now. And so we had a lot of building of that relationship in that first day. And then as he kind of trusted our intentions, he was willing to not necessarily share more information about the headdresses because he said he wasn't initiated into the appropriate societies in order to talk about them. But what he said most of all was really like music to my ears, because he said this is just the first step in a long-term relationship. He said, you can view us as, in a way, these are his words, as scouts. We've come to kind of assess this museum and its environment and its intentions and the staff. And then the next step will be, we will come, But he very much, was driving in lots of ways what was happening. So I think it's so varied, dependent on.
Yeah, and a lot of, you worked with Chuna and other people on the Anchorage project who had terrible experiences in the museum previously. So a lot of our energy went to sort of undoing that and sort of forging a new kind of relationship.
Yeah, I can also speak to working with regalia makers, one in particular who is Hoopa from California, and trying to really understand and having an experience kind of like the one that Kelly is just describing, which is that I realized I was so humbled by the amount of information I was able to learn about this feathered regalia. That, what my conservation information was, frankly, the least of it, in a way, actually. He was telling me about, not only, like he had said to me, well, do you weigh the regalia? Weight is incredibly important. I thought, no, as conservators, we never think to weigh it as part of the documentation. He was talking to me about weight. He was talking to me about this additive process that during a ceremony of performance, you would compete with other people who had their regalia, and so you would add to your regalia. So if you see things that are hastily added, I think we would make totally the wrong interpretations of what we're looking at if we don't have that additional knowledge that people are augmenting their regalia as part of the grandeur of the performance, of the importance of the performance. Plus the meanings, just as you say, like each eagle feather being significant. The same with the sort of all the associations of all these different feathers, the red-shafted flicker, the meadowlark, every one of these birds has a significance that, in looking back at the ways in which conservators in the past, because I just wrote about this actually, it's very fresh in my mind, but the idea of replacing feathers with other feathers as though that would be an acceptable compensation, because it would be acceptable for a museum story of representation, because it would look more complete, but it would be, a total change in the meaning of the regalia. So anyway, I just, and then to Jim's point about, the trust aspect, I've also, it's varied so much based on the circumstances. When I was at Brooklyn, and it was newly after NAGPRA had been legislated, and the museum was inviting in consultants to review the collections. Those were often, opportunities for mistrust and miscommunication. I mean, they were difficult. I mean, there were difficult times. I mean, I remember being told that something should be destroyed in our storage because it was inappropriate for it to be assembled. And I said, I can't destroy it, actually. I'm not mandated by my institution in some way to be the person to destroy it. But if it were requested for repatriation, I actually think that would be a very good thing, because I think actually it would be, it would have a more beneficial effect were it returned. But there were very difficult discussions.
So as communities, so as a door is open for communities to work with museums, it seems that there's also a growing responsibility for you all, even more so than ever. That there may be a spin-off to this is something that we didn't realize, is that, wow, now suddenly some community members feel like I can say and talk about these things now. But again, being in this situation where a mic is on, there's an attentive audience, and maybe that person shouldn't be talking about some of these things. But they feel like I'm in a place where there's authority in a museum, and I'm going to talk about these things. And if another community was there, they might be nudging them or kicking them under the table and saying, hey, you're going too far. So what do you do about that kind of thing when somebody from a community, you get a sense that somebody's telling you maybe more than you should know?
Well, we don't know what we don't know.
Right.
So
Yes.
actually, we oftentimes don't know that they're telling us things that we shouldn't know, to be honest. But I do think we do have a responsibility. Again, I think in this example with Northern Cheyenne, it's like the way it's going to play out is exactly the way it should play out, in that, there's time. I think often these things happen on a short schedule, and I think we on the museum side need to build in time for, those conversations to take place in the community, to decide how much information is appropriate to share with the museum. Because I know at NMAI, we're so physically separated from most of the communities that we represent in the museum that we have 3 days, and it's easy to get caught up. I mean, all of us get caught up. It's exciting, we're all sharing information. And so, if that happens, I may not know, but I also think that maybe we can build in a schedule that doesn't actually put somebody in that place, or be a little bit more cognizant of how we approach it. And I know it's different for the regional.
Yeah, but I think also giving people the opportunity to review the notes and what they told you before it goes into the museum record is super important. And that's in the guidelines.
It's in the guidelines, right? Absolutely, yeah.
So the idea of
Yeah.
collaboration then, we've been talking about it a lot, and I think it's also a time that for us to maybe take a moment and think about what collaboration really is, because it's a word that can be used too cavalierly, too liberally. And have you had instances where you've heard people say they're collaborating, but it really isn't collaboration?
Yes. There's that rubber stamping thing that goes on where all the decisions are made by the curators or whomever, and people are invited in, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? And, sort of like, yeah, I guess, what are the options, but that's not discussed. So people will say, well, we collaborated with this community, but it's actually just sort of a canned or formulaic kind of thing that happens.
And also maybe really thinking about the nature of the projects, because we're engaging in a project with the Poe Center, and again, this is the idea is a long-term relationship. And even in the course of working together, you can see the level of the way the work happens is changing, you know, and it is becoming more truly collaborative. And I don't think we can underestimate how much it takes to truly have collaboration. I mean, it is a relationship that takes time, like dating, you know. I mean.
Yeah, so no date is the same as any other.
That's right.
Yeah, and each one is different. There is no sort of, you know, how-to. It's, yeah.
It's actually, so, you know, I realize that since I've been working with Agua Caliente tribe since 2005, and our relationships get deeper and deeper and deeper. You know, it's now, it's like, you know, it's been, you know, 10 years, more than 10 years now since we've been working together. And I also realize that the students don't recognize, because for them, it's only new. It's only new for the students. But for me, it's this relaxed and deeper. And the other thing that's interesting, which sort of speaks to this, is that the students in my evaluations, they always say, I wish you would give us a lecture about how to do this beforehand, you know, because they speak to this intimidation. And anyway, so, but a lecture, it's like, no, that's not, I mean, anyway, so.
Yeah.
But I mean, hopefully this, you know.
The guidelines,
right.
The guidelines, yes.
Because I think that is some of the challenges that there, you know, there hasn't been any kind of framework on the museum training side that, at least for conservation, and I will say, I think conservation's pretty far behind anthropology in this regard. So I think that it's something that now is acknowledged in our field as a necessity, and I think, you know, there could be perhaps, you know, more of a framework.
And opening up the field, I think, is just absolutely key. And Ellen's involved with an initiative, or heading up an initiative right now that's very important. But, you know, 3 white women, and, you know, our profession is very, you know, not diverse. And, you know, having local options, you know, valuing different kinds of expertise, I think these are all important, and the only way that we'll see a more diverse profession. Yeah. Ellen, you should talk about your
Speaking about diverse, yeah, so
Okay.
that definitely caught my attention
yeah.
as well. Okay, I'm going to interview 3 women in this
Yeah,
field that
right.
represents
Right.
museums.
Yeah, 3 white women.
3 non-native
Yeah,
women.
3 non-native women.
That are
So,
sharing.
very briefly, thank you, Landis, for bringing this up. I've gotten funding for a 4-year pilot program that's going to include, at the first phase, a lot of outreach, so the development of outreach materials, and then actually performing outreach by visiting undergraduate colleges and universities that tend to have diverse populations of students who are underrepresented in conservation. They're going to be Western states predominantly, because it's too big to do otherwise. And then, and I've convened some advisors, and these 2 women, I might add, are going to be advisors, along with a very, really interesting, powerful group of people. Wonderful. And then we're going to offer a fully funded 6-day workshop over the summer of 2018. So students will be fully supported to participate in a 6-day workshop, introducing them to museum work, not curatorial per se, but collections-based work. So they'll meet with registrars, they'll meet with collections managers, they'll meet with conservators, and those students will have an opportunity after those 6 days to apply for the next summer a fully funded pre-program internship, so that they can actually intern in a museum or collecting repository and start to build the resources for going to graduate school. So I have to say I have a graduate school bent, and appreciation for having students be toe-to-toe with everybody else who's in the field, but bringing a different point of view. So that program will run for, it'll be 2 cohorts. So there'll be a cohort in 18-19 and a cohort in 19-20.
So that program is it specifically targeting Native communities?
It's targeting actually Native and Latino, and it comes largely out of the populations in California, who are largely, there are many sort of mixed people of mixed background, but we will go to some Native American colleges to try to do some outreach efforts, hopefully attracting people.
So I guess the context of communities, so Ellen's doing some great work there. She's definitely breaking some ground. But let me ask the two of you then, since this question. Do you agree or disagree with this following statement? While we are creating opportunities for communities to engage more with museums and collections, we are overlooking work to build the capacity of communities to do this work themselves. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Can you read that one more time?
While we are creating opportunities for communities to engage more with museums and the collections,
right,
we're creating those opportunities, but we are overlooking work to build the capacity of those communities to do the work themselves.
I would agree with that statement in the sense that, again, you can make the field more diverse. But again, it's like, it's complicated, I think. I agree, but it's complicated in the sense that I think...
Why is it complicated?
Well, I think there has to be some fundamental understanding of, you can't necessarily chart where you're going. Like, we don't really know where this path is necessarily taking us. But I think it's like, ultimately, what are we hoping for? And I think if we're hoping for, Native communities to care for their cultural material and to have authority over their cultural material, that model may not get us there. What it can help do is it would improve the existing model, put it that way. But I think in many ways we're talking about not necessarily 2 different things, but I don't know. That's a hard question, Jim.
Well, on the positive side, I would say that by engaging with museums, that there's a process there. There's an exposure to what's going on in a museum, and that could be helpful.
Yeah, I think it is helpful. I mean, again, to me, the awareness, if you're working in a museum, if you have the awareness, if you have, and I don't want to say regardless of the color of your skin, because it does make a difference, most certainly. But I think, if you have this negotiated relationship that is long-term, then maybe that does shift where the community is then taking care of, their collections. It's hard to know. I mean, I think for me personally, that's the direction that I keep trying to get to. I'm not really sure where I'm trying to go, but I'm trying to walk down that certain path more, so it doesn't feel so kind of one-sided in the care of.
And sometimes we have to learn to walk straight on a crooked path.
Yeah.
So we talked about these collaborations and some that have been successful, but have you had experience or have you seen sometimes what leads to a disengagement in collaboration? Where there was once a collaboration and then a disengagement. What caused that?
The only thing I've seen is when, let's say, conservators or other museum staff think of it as a one-way street and are grilling people in a way that is frankly kind of rude. And that just turned people off. But yeah.
And I've seen a scenario where I think that the people working on this particular project didn't fully understand the dynamics within the tribe, and were actually talking to not the correct people, and that caused a lot of conflict. It wasn't complete disengagement, but the museum had to work very hard in order to save that relationship, I guess you could say.
Do words get in the way? I mean, is there sometimes something lost in translation? And we talk about we want our work to be accessible. And that means sometimes making some changes to our vernacular. And is that the case here with building relationships and creating situations for collaborations with communities? You guys have definitely a unique kind of vernacular, words and glossary, right? Does that ever get in the way?
Yes.
Yeah, very,
Yes.
very jargony.
And I'm looking
Like
right
what?
at Bruce, actually, who who was one of the greatest teachers of that when he was at NMAI. He was like, just call it glue. I mean, it's, or why does it have to be this? Just call it what it is, or
What were you calling it?
what we were calling it, adhesive. Or B72 adhesive, and you don't really
Acrylic
realize
polymer.
it because
Acrylic polymer?
Acrylic polymer.
you've gone through your training in order to develop that vernacular.
Right.
That's what you've
Right.
learned, and so you almost don't even realize that you're using it when you're just talking, but it definitely can get in the way. It creates barriers. If it's all about communication, it doesn't, facilitate great communication.
Yeah.
Ellen?
And I have to say that one of the drills in particular the class that I was discussing earlier, when we engage with, a lot of community members, and they all come to hear the final work that the students have done, that they come to appreciate the outcomes. And I have to convince the students, I know you just learned all your fancy pants kind of discussion here, about, this instrument, or you used this, or you did this, but you've got to be totally legible. You've got to be understood here. You've got to communicate, step back from our jargon and just communicate, and I have to say, there are some students who can't do it, which is, it's upset. I mean, it's unhappy making, but not every student can do it. Yeah. So.
What, Ellen, you have experience with that, with jargon, words getting in the way?
Similar to, yes. Yeah, I'd just be repeating what they said. So.
And never mind, even the next level of that is translating it to another language.
Yeah.
And for some of the people that may be working with you may have English, maybe in a situation where English is their second language.
But I do want to say there's a flip side to that, because I think that more recently we're working with people who are very interested in utilizing our scientific tools for their use. And so I think we can't assume, you know what I mean? Again, I think in some ways that's a wrong assumption to think that not everybody is coming to have that kind of engagement, because that's definitely been the case where, basket weavers wanted to use an XRF, to look at. So I think,
What is an SRF?
come on, Jim.
See? There we go.
The portable X-ray fluorescence machine.
Okay.
Yeah, to look at different elements.
Looks like a Star Wars.
Yeah. So, I think we have to be careful about that too,
Yeah, we've had potters who are very interested in learning some of our techniques for stabilizing a crack, let's say, and wants to know about what is this resin and how do you mix it up and how is it applied. So there's more of an exchange sometimes, I think. And some of the jargon isn't really jargon, but it's just the actual name of something,
Yeah. I guess I think it's good to not make assumptions, about
Yeah.
what people, it's good to talk to, it's sort of like when you,
Really condescending.
yeah, like when you speak to people who you just, they're smart, but they're not specializing in the same thing you are. There's a way that you do that. And I think that's the way to, approach it. And, if people, as you say, if somebody wants to use the XRF and has great familiarity, or they want to use, they want to know about which resin you're using, be available for it. Yeah. So.
I think that raises a good point, that I think people in our communities, they're very, very different, right? There's young people that tend to lean towards certain kinds of gizmos or things like that, and that's fine. And there's others that are challenged to use those sort of things, or just don't want to use those things. And I think in your work as well, that's people are going to come to you and they want to work with the gizmos and gadgets, and there's others are going to say, no, we just want to do things our way, the old way. So how do you then? That's another, I guess, challenge of doing these collaborations with communities, because you want communities to work with you, and we know that there are disparate knowledges to work with. How do you mediate that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
That's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question.
I think it's different every time, actually.
Every time,
Yeah.
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 That's an easy answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to a couple of, recent experiences, and the people, sort themselves out, even within the group that's come to, that we're spending time with you, and you sort of, it becomes clear that, you just kind of, one person, this was actually a difference between people who are very traditional and people who are not very traditional. So one person who felt that prayers were really, really important, and this other person who actually, didn't. And, so there were very different, propensities, but it was just kind of letting everybody do what they needed to do, so.
Yeah, I think that speaks to your attentiveness to this, because what, at least myself, what I don't want to see is one pan-native way of doing this. That that every community is going to have a different way of doing things, and then with every community there's going to be different individuals or groups with different channels of influence and ideas as well. So it's complex, but then again, these guidelines never existed before, so this is all new stuff. All new stuff. So as we're talking about these, how museums have done some great work, and the guys that, you're definitely serving like bellwethers, you're beacons for this kind of work, I think. So how would or should museums rate themselves in how they are actually working with communities? Should they rate themselves, or should communities rate the museums?
That's interesting, yeah.
Like, should there be an Angie's list of that museum is very, very difficult, that museum is wonderful to work with, they're the ones you want to work with, they're the ones you don't want to work with, don't waste your time with them. So how would an organization rate themselves?
Part of the problem, though, Jim, with that, sometimes it comes down to the individual
It does.
that you're dealing with in the museum. So, so-and-so could contact, this registrar or this collections manager who is very welcoming and open and easy to work with, and they could also contact somebody else. So it's hard to say the museum, I think, because, it does come down to the individual so much.
Right, and I think that's thank you for that, because that I think you're right, that all it takes is one experience with one person to change everything, right? And so then it would have to be something in the organization's institutional DNA, really.
Yeah.
And for that to happen,
Yeah.
it needs to be policy, right? And current policies don't often support these kinds of collaborations, right?
That's right.
That's right.
So policy is made by trustees. Right? Trustees make policy and monitor policies. And so how do you see then your work influencing trustees and the policy?
I think directors have a lot to do with it too.
Of course, sure.
With, you know.
But even
with
directors take their
word from the
their-
trustees.
from the trustees, right?
Yeah, it's true.
And I think still there can be policy, and unless the individuals are going to, you know, implement that policy, again, coming down to the individual.
But I do think it's maybe educating the trustees, you know? I mean, there is something we can do in terms of trying to, I mean, it's not easy to have access to the trustees. You have access to your director or, but I know that when our trustees have come through on tours, you know, we really take the opportunity to show, you know, the impact of this work. And one thing that they keep asking us is, okay, well, what is in it for the tribes? And that's actually a really important question that hasn't been really addressed, I think. But I do think that, again, like, you know, because if they are, I had heard after they had come through that they were in a meeting and they were talking about what they had seen in conservation and they were excited about it and they wanted to see more of it. So in a way that puts then pressure on the director to allocate funds or to, you know, support that work. So
But NMAI is, you know, it's sort of their mission.
So exceptional.
It is.
And you're dealing with the
Yeah.
board, the trustees are there because they somehow buy into that mission, you know, would you say?
no, that's 100% true. I mean, we're
Yeah.
starting from a different platform, of course. But I
Yeah.
think, though, still, again, it requires education or marketing, or it requires, you know,
For conservation
enthusiasm.
per se.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
to
It needs
get,
to be strategic, it has to make
it
sense.
has to be strategic, yeah.
It makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to this thing like sentiments or ethics alone is not going to create the change. But
Right,
if a trustee sees that this makes sense and
Right.
is strategic to the mission,
right.
then.
I mean, and I always like to say, you know, in doing this work, I mean, it is efficient. We, you know, for the inaugural exhibits, I'm certain it saved the museum money. I'm certain all the time that this engagement saves the museum money. I mean, I know that it saves us in terms of our directed approach to what we're doing. And, you know, if the designer and the framer or whoever is in the room at the same time, you know, you're working more efficiently. And so, you know, I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well.
How to be being efficient and effective,
Exactly. And producing better work, as Landis always says, yeah.
as we always want to do. I think it's be a good time now to take some questions then from the audience, and I'll ask you respectfully, please make them questions, not just statements. A real question for the group here. Yes.
I'm confused with the definition of the word community. I gather that it's not just about Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, but there are other variables out there. Could you define that for me, please?
Yeah, it's defined right here.
That's a great question,
It's a
though.
great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says the terms community and community members refer to tribes and tribal members, as well as native corporations or any community seeking to collaborate with the museum.
Yeah, so specifically, these folks here, these people are primarily working with Native communities. So there's communities that have items of their culture, their heritage that are in museums. So there was some discussion about whether to call them indigenous peoples, Native peoples, so on, Native American peoples, American Indian peoples, and so on. And the group decided that many people in Native communities call themselves their communities. refer to our communities, or we say, like, I work with my community, so that's where that comes from, is communities. But I think later on, I think the same idea, the same thing can work in other situations. I mean, if it was a museum about trains or Air and Space Museum, I think very similarly, a community might be the people who designed turbines or designed
The
things
train
like that.
community.
The trains would be that community. So that's what specifically what it's referring to. Let's take another question. Anybody else? Yes, sir, you were quick.
Can I piggyback on this gentleman's good question?
Oh, so, yes,
So we have heard a lot of talk about communities, and we've also heard a lot of talk about the way in which communities are, for want of a better term, fluid and changing and not mono-minded or single-minded. Are the guidelines similarly fluid and changing, or do they admit of fluidity, admit of change? And if that's not the case, in what sense exactly are the guidelines? I promise I mean that question in
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah.
altogether friendly way. This is really seriously hard stuff.
Yeah, I think we always viewed these as a fluid document and one that would evolve and change. But it's kind of difficult you have to capture something and to reflect all of the components in one thing is challenging, but I think it was a starting point, I guess you could say. And we always did view it as evolving based on experience in the utilization of them, I think you could say.
And a lot of it are, suggestions and things to consider. It's not sort of like, do this, this, this. It's more of a, suggestions, I guess. And we also always thought that it would be updated, at least every year, I think, or 2 years or so. Well, we'll try.
And remember that there were also many of the communities, so the native communities, so representatives from different communities were also part of this, and they were certainly very helpful in vetting different parts of the document, and what should be in, what should be out, what makes sense, what doesn't. And it seems like every time you meet with another community, there's something else to add or something else to remove. So it's definitely going to be a fluid kind of a document. Okay.
Hi. You talked, kind of framed the discussion in the Americas, specifically the West and the Southwest. I was just wondering if there are other countries where models of collaboration between native communities and museums can give us some guidance.
Yeah, well, I mean, the others can jump in too, but I know definitely of Canada and BC, British Columbia, New Zealand, Australia, they've all been very active in this, and in some areas they're ahead, and in some areas they're somewhat catching up to, I don't want to say catching up, but they're approaching things in a very different way, as you would think. But there are examples in many parts of the world, yes. In fact, these guidelines and the next guidelines, as I said, will be how museums can work with communities. There has been interest throughout the world. There's been interest from many, many people around the world that want to learn something. I mean, it isn't the final, this is the way it is. It's just definitely another reference, but albeit a very important one.
Yeah, in New Zealand, for example, there's something called the Waitangi Treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi, and it actually mandates every public museum to be co-operated by Maori and by non-Maori, kind of co-equally, always coming to the table. And it's resulted in, I recall that, remember, we were so struck when we learned from Rangi Takanawa that there was a sort of effective training program to get Maori to be working in conservation, those who were interested. And it happened on the occasion of this passage of this treaty, you know,
But I
kind
will-
of necessitated it.
But just to say, I remember her
Yeah.
talking about the complexity she felt
Yeah.
as a Maori person
Yeah.
working in the museum. And
Yeah.
so, you know, this
Yeah.
isn't, none of this is really that easy, you
No.
know? I think that's,
Yeah.
that's the thing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Universally not easy.
I wanted to say thank you to Ellen and Kelly and Landis and Jim for being here, for the privilege of this community being able to participate and learn, because I think this is really important, and I think it's a privilege granted by SAR and IARC, and I want to thank this for happening. Last week, Tim Wilcox mentioned in his work at Stanford as an artist that it was difficult, challenging for him to collaborate with his nation, with his community on what he was doing. Landis, you mentioned a landmark work that was difficult, that maybe was a watershed for improved relations. Can you talk a little bit more about how to get to collaboration when it's difficult and challenging, and when there's difficult moments when it maybe made something like you want to give up or lose hope?
Take it away.
Well, that is a good question, actually, and I appreciate your question because, you know, I think I kind of enter into this knowing that I'm going to screw up at some point, in the sense that, you know, I think the understanding that we're doing the best we can, that when you approach collaboration or you approach, you know, working with someone, really anyone, right, in your professional relationship, if people can see your intent is sincere, whether or not you know the right protocol or you have the right information or you're actually doing the right or wrong thing. And so I think, you know, you approaching it in that way is fundamental. There are times where I have to say, like, I think that if the intent on by both parties is that, there is usually the opportunity to work through some of the difficulties. And I think there has to be honesty in that, in the challenges, because they exist, you know. And so when there is honesty and good intention and trust, you can navigate some very complicated conversations and complicated situations. You know, the thing is that this work is so important that, you know, the challenges, actually, I appreciate when there are those challenges because I think it helps us move forward. Again, unless we're kind of honest about some of these difficulties and where, you know, we hit these points, we won't get past them. So I really appreciate when we have the opportunity to kind of work through some of those really difficult periods.
I think it's, exactly. And, you know, allowing that shift to happen during those collaborative, you know, during that work, you know, where there's a sense of ownership and authority that you are obviously acknowledging is super important. And then just, you know, like practical things like hospitality, that people come to the museum and there's coffee and people, you know, get to know each other a little bit before they dive into the work. You know, where are you coming from? Where are we coming from? And it's a slow process, but it can be incredibly rewarding and effective.
Thank you.
Let's do two more questions.
Hi. I'm an art conservation student at the Buffalo State program, and I was curious. First of all, I have to say I would really love to take your class at UCLA. We have students coming in. And so my question is, has there been or will there be a movement to introduce these themes and tools into the curriculum of the other art conservation programs? And I guess in a broader sense to like museum studies programs across the nation to, you know, give all students these tools and set this spark in all the students who are going to go to museum studies.
Maureen?
I wanted to sort of add on to that too. how do you see within our community of conservation, in large encyclopedic collections that have big holdings of Native American artifacts, who they also have many layers of administration and have not really begun this process yet? I mean, I've worked at a lot of those museums, and you have too, and it's, how do we then approach those places? I think that's something very similar to what Sylvia's asking.
Let's answer the first question first about the integration of these ideas in curriculum.
I know that one of the things, not to be too jargony or obscure, but one of the movements in conservation now is referred to as risk assessment, sort of assessing the major risks to collections. And part of that is an evaluation of value or significance, because it's kind of based on this thing, the things that are most valued, you privilege the most, right? You sort of try to save them first, let's say. That's the concept. And I think actually, I know that, for example, at the NYU Institute of Fine Arts program, they're starting to teach a class that is considering values and significance before conservation decision making. So I think that, and actually I was asked for copies of my syllabi. So I know that there is a little bit of movement. I think there is some movement. I think Bruno Pouliot at Winterthur is also kind of open, and probably engaging. So there have been at some of the other, conservation programs. I think if for no other reason than just by virtue of this whole idea of, wait a minute, take a step back, think about the value and the significance, that's causing a larger change, and will impact conservation education more generally. Yeah, I think so. But then the other question about the encyclopedic, I have an answer to that too. You want me?
Yeah, I think you have,
I can
just keep
answer
going,
that too.
Ellen.
Just keep going? Okay. I don't want to kill you with my forward, but, so, I have to say that I worked, for 25 years in an encyclopedic museum, and it was both pre and post NAGPRA. I was there all over those years, and actually, there were very special things about that museum that that heightened the awareness of communities and the need to consult with communities and the need to partner with communities. But then I would say that just the passage of NAGPRA, which obligates every federally funded institution to report their holdings to the tribes, the affiliated tribes, that by its very nature, even in an encyclopedic museum, cannot be missed. It cannot be missed, right? I worked in a museum where when repatriation or the thought of repatriation was first entertained, I would sit at a table with all these curators, one of whom worked on European decorative arts, one of whom worked on Egyptian archaeology, one of whom worked on, fill in the blank, modern art, somebody else, European paintings. And, everybody would say, repatriation? People are going to come from European churches. People are going to come and say, this was in a European church. And we need this, we need to take this, So there was this, so there was a committee that formed that essentially kept stressing the importance of this work and educated all, not every curator jumped on board and thought it was great, but, I think that you need to find your kindred spirits who believe in this at the institution, build a group, that can advocate for the importance of this, irrespective of the type of museum. I think it's possible,
Well, let's,
or others should.
Nina, you had a question?
Yes.
Okay,
I
Nina.
have a statement, but I'll finish with a question. So at NMAI, Kevin Gover's overarching goal is to essentially educate the public to tease out racism, right? When the work that you're doing, you're connecting with communities, you're building relationships, you're becoming a community as part of the Native community as well. So where do administrators and curators stand in that? Because, and I don't know everything, but it seems to some degree curators are sort of immune to where they can participate, or they don't have to if they don't necessarily agree with whatever it is that you've brought to the table. And how often do curators come to you to, as a source of knowledge when they don't have access to the communities? And how can that sort of shift, because they're the ones who are responsible for essentially interpreting these collections for the public. So you could have all the knowledge in the world, but the rest of us will never know because of what the curator is giving us.
I will say that at NMAI that was a shift, because when the directors, Rick West and Kevin Gover, while executing the mission of the museum, had different approaches to doing that. So Kevin's, as you said, is really about educating mostly non-native people who are coming off the National Mall to combat ignorance. Rick West, his approach was definitely rooted in a community-based approach. And so at the Cultural Resources Center, Bruce Bernstein, we infiltrated in a way this methodology that affected all departments. And we worked in collaboration with communities in all departments. So conservation was one of those. So when the director changed, and the resources, because curatorial worked in that fashion as well. When the resources were shifted, we were very fortunate because we have funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to give postgraduate conservation students an experience in and an education in working with communities so that they can take away the value of that as they move throughout their career. So we have stayed true to that kind of methodology. And what's interesting now is that the curators, like you said, they do come in and out of that. And there are, like even at an institution like NMAI, this is not an automatic assumption that this happens anymore. And so in conservation, we've remained committed to it. And we've remained committed to it because I don't think any of us can imagine working in any other way. I would actually feel like I was not being responsible if I did not work in this manner. And so, it's a commitment to this, and it's a commitment to evolving this. But your question is a good one, and I think, people automatically think that this work is happening at NMAI and that it's easy for it to happen at NMAI, but it's not entirely.
Right, well, the panel members will be here for a few minutes afterwards if you have some urgent questions for them. I want to thank you all for coming out, and that I think this work says something about where we are in the field, that we're not simply acquiescing to stagnant ways of doing our own business, and that, guidelines for communities is not the final answer, it is a start, and that difficulties can either halt us or they can motivate us. And I think, as President Kennedy once said, that sometimes we do things that are hard. We need to do things that are hard, and that I still believe that museums are important places, and they are trend-setting places, and they are an important part of the social makeup of our nation that is important for creating a more informed citizenry. So thank you very much for being out, and we'll be here for a few minutes. Thank you.